Hello, AP Environmental, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Environmental Systems. So, this will be a very quick story, so gather around the pond, my little tadpoles, as we venture into environmental systems. We're going to start off with the story of a lake of saltwater, dust storms, and endangered species. This lake shows us that activities of humans and the lives of other organisms and abiotic processes even, and all of this environmental factors are interconnected. Humans, water, animals, plants, and even the desert environment all interact at Mono Lake, and they create this very complex environmental system. This case demonstrates how a single change made to an ecosystem often has a wide range of unexpected consequences. Located between the deserts of the Great Basin and the mountains of Sierra Nevada in California, Mono Lake is an unusual sight. It is characterized by these eerie towers of limestone rock known as what we call tupela. Unique animal species live in these glassy waters, and it often experiences these dust storms, unusual for a lake, honestly. Mono Lake is what we call a terminal lake, which means that the water flows into it, but it never flows out. As water moves through the mountains and deserts and soil, it picks up lots of salt and other minerals, which are attached to substrate and rocks within the actual soil, and it's all deposited in this lake. And then as the water evaporates, these minerals are left behind. So here we can see an example of how the input brings with it salts. They're collected in this terminal lake system, and then water evaporates out, but as you know, salts do not leave with water, so they stay behind. So there's a lot of these dissolved salts inside of this lake, and that comes together to form these little towers. These tufa towers, as they're called. You could probably guess that Mono Lake is home to very few species. There are actually two that I'd like to discuss, the brine shrimp and then the larva of a fly. All of these are species which tolerate the conditions of this lake, these extremely high saline salt type of conditions. The brine shrimp and this particular fly, they eat microscopic algae that grows in the lake. And in turn, these large flocks of birds and sandpipers, gulls, and flycatchers use the lake as what we call a stopover. And they basically feed off of these brine shrimp on their migration journey, and the fly larvae as well. And that basically replenishes their energy storage through this desolate environment as they travel. So the lake is really an oasis for migration route for migratory birds, and it's also come to be the only dependent real food source out there. The health of Mono Lake is therefore critical for many species, and definitely many species of migratory birds. So in 1913, the city of Los Angeles drew up this controversial plan to redirect water from Mono Lake. It's been in a lot of books that I've read before. And its neighbor, this larger and more shallower lake called Owens Lake, was diverted first. And they diverted it about 223 miles into an aqueduct that basically drew water away from the springs and the streams that kept Owens Lake full. So soon the lake began to dry up. It dried up completely by 1930, and only this empty salt flat kind of remained. So today, that dry lake bed is about 109,000 acres, and it is the nation's it's the nation's largest source of windblown dust, which basically lowers the visibility out in these areas that are pretty much desolate and now designated as national parks. Even to make matters worse, from that 1930s aqueduct reroute, just due to the actual local geology in this particular area, the dust contain these high concentrations of arsenic, which is a major threat to human life in general. So by the 1940s, despite the environmental degradation of Owens Lake, Los Angeles extended the aqueduct and started to draw from the streams that were actually feeding Mono Lake. So by the 80s, with less fresh water feeding into Mono Lake, its depth had decreased to about 14 meters on average, being the deepest points of it about 45 feet. And the salinity of the water had more than doubled. Not that they could have probably measured it accurately, but we know that it was twice as salty come the 80s. And so this salt lake became extra salty, and with extra salt, if you know something about like saltwater pools, algae can't grow in it. And so when algae can't grow, the shrimp can't eat, so the shrimp and the larvae died. That being said, most of the birds stayed away. It was no longer a good hot spot to stay over. And so a newly exposed land bridge allowed coyotes from the desert to prey on the colonies of these nesting migratory birds. Just when it appeared that Mono Lake would never be recovered, circumstances changed. It took about 15 years. In 1994, after the years of litigation from what we call the National Audubon Society, which is a society that protects these migratory birds, I'm assuming they sued the Los Angeles. They tirelessly worked to get the city of Los Angeles, their water department, and their power department to finally agree to reduce the amount of water that was diverted to allow the lake to refill. And they did, and it refilled about 2/3, which is kind of its recent historical depth. But by the summer of 2009, lake levels had risen to just short of the goal of thermal pool, which is where they wanted it to return to, and the ecosystem was slowly recovering. And as recently here as 2013, water levels remained close to their very, very target goal, and so now the brine shrimp are thriving and many birds are returning to Mono Lake. So water is a scarce resource out in the West, and especially in Los Angeles, and this demand is particularly high. The decreased amount of water diverted from Mono Lake, the city of Los Angeles had to reduce its water consumption, period. The city converted grass lawns requiring a great deal of water to these native shrubs, and required people to replace their lawns with drought-tolerant species. And it imposed a lot of new rules on its citizens, requiring low-flow shower heads to be installed and water-saving toilets. Though these seem like relatively small things for its citizens to do, it can be very effective to make these small changes. And Los Angeles was able to cut their water consumption and in turn protect this nesting bird sanctuary, and of course the brine shrimp, and of course an algae population. And Mono Lake was eventually restored. So this is a story that just shows us that how the activities of humans and the lives of other organisms and even an abiotic process in an environment is connected. So not only is the abiotic process in this environmental example interesting, but it also reminds us that changing one thing can basically devastate or recreate an ecosystem. And organisms, non-living matter, and all of energy is interacting in a natural system. And so taking a system-type approach to anything in environmental science and with environmental issues basically decreases the chance of overlooking important components within that issue.